Hello, and welcome to the Psychology of Us. I'm Professor RJ Starr, and today we're going to talk about something you've definitely seen, maybe even done yourself, without realizing its consequences. Have you ever heard someone confidently explain a complex issue after watching a 90-second video? Maybe they saw a TikTok summarizing a psychological concept, or read a headline about neuroscience, and suddenly they're an expert. Maybe you've even felt that way yourself, thinking, oh, I get the gist of it. But here's the question. Do you really? Because there's a difference between hearing a soundbite and truly understanding something. And in today's world, where information moves at lightning speed and attention spans are shrinking, more and more people believe they've grasped an idea when they've barely scratched the surface. Now, don't get me wrong, summaries, short videos, and bite-sized learning can be useful. They give us quick insights, help us grasp the broad strokes of a subject, and keep us informed. But the problem is when we stop there, when we mistake exposure for expertise. I see this all the time. A student reads a 2-paragraph explainer on Carl Jung's theory of archetypes, and suddenly they feel they've gotten Jung, they've gotten the gist. Or someone watches a short documentary on cognitive biases and assumes they can diagnose every logical fallacy in an argument. But understanding, real understanding, takes more than that. And what happens when people believe they know more than they do? Well, that's where things get interesting. It leads to misplaced confidence, to the spread of misinformation, and even to a fundamental shift in how we engage with the world. So today, we're diving into the psychology of sound bites, short attention spans, and the illusion of understanding. We'll talk about why our brains love quick hits of information, why we tend to overestimate how much we actually know, and how this shift is reshaping knowledge, learning, and even decision-making. By the end of this episode, I hope you'll have a better understanding of how to recognize superficial learning in yourself and others, and more importantly, how to break free from it.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Our brains are wired for efficiency. Every second, we're bombarded with an overwhelming amount of information, far more than we can consciously process. To handle this flood of input, our brains have developed shortcuts, mental heuristics, that help us make quick judgments. These shortcuts are useful, even necessary. Without them, we'd be paralyzed by decision fatigue even before getting out of bed. But they also come with a cost. Sometimes they trick us into believing we understand something more deeply than we actually do. Take cognitive fluency, for example. This is the psychological tendency to mistake ease for truth. If something is easy to process, like a catchy slogan, a simple explanation, or a neatly packaged soundbite, our brains assume it must be accurate and complete. This is why complex scientific findings get oversimplified into viral tweets. It's why political campaigns distill intricate policies into one-liners. And it's why we're drawn to quick fixes and hacks instead of deep learning. Here's an example. I once had a student come to my office excited to discuss Sigmund Freud's theories. He told me he finally figured out psychoanalysis, all because he watched a short YouTube video that broke it down into 3 simple concepts: the id, ego, and the superego. Now, to be fair, that's a decent starting point. But when I asked him a few follow-up questions, like how Freud's ideas evolved over time, or how they relate to modern psychology, he quickly realized that he had only scratched the surface. What he had was a summary, not an understanding. The illusion of understanding isn't just anecdotal. It's been studied extensively. In 2002, researchers Leonid Rosenblatt and Frank Keel coined the term the illusion of explanatory depth. They found that most people believe they understand complex systems far better than they actually do. They ran an experiment where participants were asked how well they understood everyday objects, things like zippers, toilets, and helicopters. At first, most people were confident, but when asked to explain in detail how these objects actually worked, their confidence collapsed. They thought they knew because they had seen or used these things before. But exposure isn't the same as comprehension. And that's exactly what happens when we consume knowledge in bite-sized pieces. We mistake familiarity for understanding. We assume that because we've encountered an idea in a brief, digestible format, we get it. But deep comprehension takes effort. It requires wrestling with complexity, engaging with nuance, and sometimes sitting in the discomfort of not fully knowing. Now, another psychological principle at play here is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, their research showed that people with lower knowledge in a subject tend to overestimate their expertise, while true experts are often painfully aware of what they don't know. When we get just a small taste of a subject, enough to recognize some key terms, enough to repeat a summary, it's easy to assume we've mastered it. But real expertise comes with humility. It comes with the realization that the more you learn, the more you see how much there is still to learn. And this isn't just about academics, it plays out in everyday life. Think about social media. Every day, people confidently argue about economics, climate science, psychology, medicine, history, based on half-read articles and 30-second clips. We've all seen it. Maybe we've even done it. But when we stop at surface-level knowledge, we don't just miss out on the depth of a subject. We also risk spreading misinformation, reinforcing biases, and making decisions based on incomplete or misleading information. So if our brains prefer these shortcuts, and if society is actively reinforcing them with fast, easy content, how do we counteract this tendency? That's what we're going to explore next, how this shift in learning is changing the way we think and what it means for knowledge, critical thinking, and even decision-making. Now let's talk about the impact of superficial learning on knowledge and thinking. If we only skim the surface of knowledge, what are we actually learning? And perhaps more importantly, what are we missing? There's a growing trend, one that's hard to ignore. More and more, people are forming strong opinions, making life decisions, and even voting based on information they've gathered in mere seconds. It's as if we've collectively agreed that a headline, a tweet, or a 90-second clip is enough to fully grasp complex issues. But what happens when we substitute deep understanding with surface-level exposure? One of the biggest consequences is the erosion of critical thinking. When we rely on summaries instead of substance, we stop questioning. We stop digging deeper. Instead of analyzing arguments, considering multiple perspectives, and evaluating evidence, we accept the easiest, most accessible version of the truth. There's actually a term for this in psychology: cognitive miserliness. It refers to our tendency to rely on mental shortcuts instead of engaging in deeper, more effortful thinking. In short, our brains prefer to be lazy when it comes to processing information. And in an age where information is everywhere, at our fingertips, available in seconds, it's easier than ever to take shortcuts without even realizing it. A study conducted by Pennycook and Rand in 2019 found that people who rely more on intuitive thinking, gut reactions, immediate impressions, are significantly more likely to believe misinformation than those who engage in analytical thinking. And guess what kind of content encourages intuitive thinking? Sound bites, clickbait, social media posts designed to provoke a quick emotional response. We see this play out constantly in how people consume news. Researchers have found that most people don't even read beyond the headline before forming an opinion or sharing an article. A study from the University of California in 2016 found that 59% of the links shared on social media had never actually been clicked by the people who shared them. In other words, the headline alone was enough for them to feel informed, to feel confident enough to spread an idea they hadn't even fully engaged with. But here's where it gets even more troubling. Once a piece of misinformation takes root, it's incredibly difficult to correct. Psychologists call this the continued influence effect. Even when false information is later debunked, people continue believing it because the initial impression was stronger than the correction. This is why political misinformation, conspiracy theories, and scientific misunderstanding spread so rapidly. When people get just enough information to feel like they understand, they rarely feel the need to question it further. And this doesn't just apply to news and media, it's affecting education, personal growth, and even the way we perceive expertise. I once had a student, a bright, articulate student, who confidently explained to me that psychology wasn't really a science. When I asked where he got this idea, he said he'd seen it on a social media post, arguing that psychology doesn't follow the hard science model of physics or chemistry. They had read one perspective, a limited, oversimplified take, and stopped there. He never explored the actual scientific methodology behind psychological research, the experimental controls, the peer review process. In his mind, he already knew. And I put "knew" in quotes there. That's the problem with superficial knowledge. It convinces us that we've reached the destination when in reality we've barely taken a step. And this kind of thinking has real-world consequences. It shapes public policy. It influences healthcare decisions. It affects the way we educate future generations. When people mistake familiarity for expertise, we end up in a society where everyone feels knowledgeable, but few people actually are. A world where opinions are formed faster than questions are asked. So what can we do about this? How can we move beyond this culture of quick takes and instant expertise? That's what I'm going to talk about next, how attention spans are shifting and how we can reclaim the depth of learning in a world that constantly pulls us toward the shallow end. By now, you must be wondering, is it just me or is it getting harder to focus? You're not imagining it. The way we consume information is changing. But the real question is, are our attention spans actually shrinking? There's a popular claim that the average attention span has dropped to that of a goldfish, around 8 seconds. You may have heard this before. It's been cited everywhere, from news articles to self-help books. But the truth is, that's a myth. There's no solid scientific evidence that human attention spans are biologically shrinking. What's really happening is a shift in selective attention. We've become more impatient with what we perceive as slow or irrelevant information. Think about it. When was the last time you read an article all the way through? Or watched a long, in-depth documentary without picking up your phone? The issue isn't that we can't focus, it's that we've been conditioned to prioritize what grabs our attention the fastest. And that conditioning, it's deliberate. Let's talk about dopamine, the neurotransmitter that plays a role in pleasure, motivation, and reward. Every time you get a new piece of information, a notification, a short video, a breaking news update, your brain gets a tiny hit of dopamine. It's the same chemical reinforcement system that makes gambling addictive, or why people binge watch an entire season of a television show in one sitting. Social media platforms know this. News outlets know this. The entire digital economy is built on keeping you engaged for as long as possible. Not by giving you deep, meaningful content, but by feeding you just enough to keep you craving more. Here's how it works. You scroll, You see a headline or a short video. It's interesting, maybe even shocking. Your brain rewards you with dopamine. But instead of diving deeper, you move on to the next thing. Because why stop? There's always more, always something new. And because that quick burst of information feels like learning, we don't realize how little we're actually retaining. We're not sitting with ideas, reflecting on them, or making connections. We're consuming snapshots of knowledge, not the full picture. A study from Microsoft found that the way we interact with content has fundamentally changed. People can focus for long periods, but only when they're deeply engaged. What's really happening is a drop in our sustained attention, our willingness to stay with complex material, especially when there's easier, quicker alternatives. And that has serious implications for learning, because deep understanding doesn't come from passive scrolling. It comes from active engagement, wrestling with an idea, questioning it, and applying it to something real. I had a student once, smart, ambitious, who told me he learned philosophy from TikTok. He watched quick videos summarizing Nietzsche, Kant, and Foucault, and he genuinely believed that gave him a handle on Western philosophy. But when I asked him to explain Kant's concept of the categorical imperative, not in a sentence, but in a way that actually demonstrated understanding, he struggled. He knew the words, but not their weight. The ideas hadn't had time to take root. That's the risk of this shift in attention. When we become addicted to quick, effortless knowledge, we stop challenging ourselves to go deeper. We stop reading books. We skim articles. We rely on summaries instead of source material. And over time, we don't just lose the habit of deep learning, we lose the ability to appreciate why it matters. So how do we fight to get this back? How do we resist the pull of instant gratification and retrain ourselves to focus deeply, to think critically, and to engage with knowledge in a meaningful way? That's what I'll get into next. How to move beyond superficial learning, how to challenge the illusion of understanding, and most importantly, how to reclaim the depth and substance of real knowledge. The experiential deficit, when knowledge is theoretical and not lived. There's an old saying, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. It's one thing to know something intellectually. It's another to understand it through experience. And this is one of the biggest problems with the rise of superficial knowledge. People are mistaking exposure for expertise without ever putting what they know into practice. Think about it. Reading about swimming isn't the same as getting in the water. Watching a video about playing the piano won't make you a musician. And yet when it comes to intellectual knowledge, psychology, history, politics, science, medicine, many people assume that consuming short bursts of information is equivalent to experiencing the depth of the subject. This is what I call the experiential deficit. When people accumulate theoretical knowledge without the lived, hands-on engagement that deepens real understanding. And you can see it everywhere. Take language learning. There are countless apps that promise you that you can learn a language in 30 days by memorizing vocabulary and common phrases. But ask any bilingual speaker and they will tell you true fluency doesn't come from memorizing words. It comes from immersion, from conversation, from the struggle of translating thoughts into a new structure. The experience is what transforms theoretical knowledge into something real. Or look at leadership. You can read every book ever written about a great leader, but until you're actually in a leadership position, making difficult decisions, managing conflict, dealing with pressure, you don't really know what leadership feels like. You understand it in theory, but not in practice. And this gap between knowing and doing is a major issue in the modern world, because when people mistake superficial knowledge for true expertise, they stop seeking real-world experience. They stop questioning whether they truly grasp something beyond the words. I once had a student who was fascinated by psychology, particularly by the theories of human behavior. She could quote cognitive biases, explain attachment theory, and even referenced neuroscience research. But when I asked her how these ideas applied to real people, not just studies or theories, she hesitated. She hadn't yet observed these patterns in life. She hadn't seen how messy, unpredictable, and context-dependent human behavior can be. The knowledge was there, but the experience was missing. And here's the dangerous part. When people don't recognize this experiential gap, they develop false confidence in their knowledge. They start seeing themselves as experts when they're still at the surface level. This is a major driver behind the rise of armchair experts, people who, after watching a few documentaries or reading a handful of articles, believe they fully grasp complex ideas like climate science, economic policy, or vaccinations. A study published in Nature Human Behavior found that people who consume bite-sized knowledge are more likely to overestimate their understanding of a subject. Researchers called it the paradox of knowledge. The less we truly know, the more confident we become in our limited understanding. And this just isn't an individual issue, it has massive societal implications. It affects politics, science, and public discourse. It's why misinformation spreads so easily. It's why people argue confidently about subjects they barely understand. It's why we have an increasing divide between those who have read about problems and those who have actually worked through them. So how do we bridge this experiential gap? How do we move beyond the illusion of knowledge and toward real understanding? That's what we'll focus now. How to develop true expertise, how to engage with knowledge in a meaningful way, and how to reclaim the depth of learning in an era obsessed with speed. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, it's this. Knowing about something is not the same as truly understanding it. We live in a world that rewards speed, quick answers, fast decisions, instant reactions. But depth takes time. It requires effort, patience, and sometimes the humility to admit that we don't fully understand something yet. And that's okay. In fact, that's where real learning begins. So how do we break free from superficial knowledge? How do we reclaim the ability to engage deeply, to think critically, to truly understand rather than just recognize? The first step is active engagement. Passive consumption, watching videos, skimming articles, hearing sound bites, gives the illusion of learning, but real understanding happens when you engage with ideas. That means reading deeply, discussing, questioning. It means sitting with the concept long enough that you can not only repeat it, but apply it in a meaningful way. I always tell my students, if you want to know whether you truly understand something, try explaining it to someone else. And not just in a way that repeats the words, but in a way that actually makes sense to them. There's a reason why teaching is one of the most powerful tools for deep learning. It forces you to move beyond memorization and into comprehension. The second step, slow down. We're trained to value efficiency, but knowledge is not fast food. It's more like a slow-cooked meal. It needs time to settle, to be absorbed, to be questioned. If you're reading something important, resist the urge to rush through it. Take notes, pause to reflect. Ask yourself, what does this really mean? How does it connect to what I already know? Where might this be wrong? One of the best ways to fight superficial learning is to actively seek out perspectives that challenge you. Read full books instead of just summaries. Watch entire lectures instead of highlight reels. Have real conversations with people who know more than you, especially if they disagree with you. This is how knowledge deepens, how real expertise is built. The third step is to value curiosity over certainty. We live in a time when people are afraid to admit they don't know something. There's pressure to take a position, to be confident, to always have an answer. But the smartest people I've ever met are the ones most willing to say, I don't know, but I'd love to find out. The philosopher Socrates was famous for saying that the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. And in psychology, we see this all the time. The more someone learns about a subject, the more they realize how much more there is to explore. True intelligence is not about having quick answers. It's about asking better questions. I challenge you this week. Pick a topic you think you understand and go deeper. Read an entire book on it. Watch a full documentary and then discuss it with someone. Or better yet, try explaining it to someone in a way that makes them feel the depth of the subject. See how much more you can uncover. And most importantly, stay open, stay curious, stay engaged in the world with the world in a way that seeks depth over convenience, understanding over sound bites, truth over simplicity. Because in the end, knowledge isn't about how quickly we can consume information. It's about how deeply we allow it to shape us. I want to leave you with one final thought. We live in a time when knowledge is more accessible than ever, but accessibility is not the same as depth. Right now, you can pull out your phone and learn more about quantum physics, ancient philosophy, or psychological theories in a matter of seconds than ever before. And that's incredible. We have more information at our fingertips than any generation has ever had before us. But what we do with that information, that's what matters. Do we skim it and move on? Or do we sit with it, engage with it, challenge ourselves to truly understand? Because here's the reality. Shallow knowledge is easy. Deep understanding is earned. The world is full of people who mistake familiarity for expertise. People who assume that because they've heard a term before, they get it. But true learning, the kind that shapes who you are, requires more than that. It requires curiosity, patience, and the willingness to say, I don't know yet, but I want to find out. So as you go forward, I encourage you to slow down, question more, read more, pay attention to how ideas connect, not just how they are packaged. And when you catch yourself feeling like you got the gist of something, ask yourself, do I really understand this? Or do I just recognize it?
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.